Welcome to my channel. Make sure you hit the like button, share, and subscribe. This is part 4 of the Boobie Boys. May 17th, 1995, 7 p.m. Otis Green smiled and waved to the security guard as he drove into the Colors complex. His girlfriend, Alice Gardner, was seated in the front seat of his gold Nissan Altima. On her lap was her 5-year-old son, Mikey. In the back seat was their friend, Brian Gibson. There was only one entrance and exit to the Colors, and it was manned by a security guard who would raise and lower a gate arm painted with red and white stripes to allow access. The exit gate automatically opened when its sensors detected a vehicle. Green was unaware that a burgundy-colored Honda had followed him in. The Honda was stolen and had been hidden at a warehouse owned by E4 for just this type of hit. Anthony Brantley was the driver of the Honda. It was also occupied by Plex and Bush. Plex was armed with an AK-47 and Bush with a MAC-10. The weapons had also been secreted at the warehouse along with black dicky outfits and black ski masks, which all three were wearing. E4 had ordered them to wait in the parking lot of nearby Van E. Blanton Elementary School until he called on his cell phone. E4 and one of his most trusted lieutenants, Wayne Baptiste, aka Fat Wayne, were playing basketball on the court in the center of the Colors parking area, but they weren't concerned with keeping score. They kept a constant eye on the intersection of Northwest 103rd Street and 12th Avenue for Otis Green's Altima. As soon as they spotted it, E4 called Brantley. Brantley arrived at the Colors just in time to pull the stolen Honda directly behind Green's sedan as it approached the security gate. When the guard lifted the gate to allow Green to enter, Brantley followed him only inches from his bumper and drove through the gate before it closed. The plan was to box Green in when he parked in his regular space, but he unexpectedly stopped and shouted something out of the driver's window to one of the workers on the 3rd floor. Seizing the opportunity, Brantley pulled behind the Altima, and Plex and Bush jumped out with their weapons. Knowing what was about to happen, Brantley quickly backed the Honda up so he would not be hit by a stray bullet. The gunmen positioned themselves on either side of the Nissan and began firing into the vehicle. Each shooter emptied their 30-round clips into the interior of the sedan. They then ran to the getaway car and fled back to the warehouse, where they changed into their regular clothes, hiding the car and guns. Otis Green died instantly, riddled with bullets. On the floor mat at his feet was an automatic pistol that he was unable to retrieve. His girlfriend and 5-year-old Mikey were transported by fire rescue, but both passed away en route to Jackson Memorial Hospital. Had he not been slaughtered by E4 and his crew, Mikey would have started kindergarten in the fall. Brian Gibson was the only person in the vehicle who survived. Over 50 shell casings were collected at the crime scene. All the 7.62 casings were tested ballistically and determined to be an exact match with the casings found at the Everett Cooper murder scene. The killing of Mikey Frazier made national news, even though the nation was numb by this time to rampant violence and soaring murder rates. The killing of a young preschooler still struck a sympathetic chord and resonated with parents all over the country. Residents of Miami-Dade County demanded answers. It was quickly reported that Otis Green was a major dope dealer, but the public was still outraged over the death of an innocent child. Even Plex showed some remorse. He claimed he had no idea that a youngster was in the car. When he found out, he told Anthony Brantley's brother Cedric. That little boy didn't deserve it, but Otis did. Months later, Plex was still clearly haunted by the death of Michael Frazier and had a tattoo emblazoned on his chest. Winged praying hands with Mikey written above them. Just 3 months after participating in the triple murder at the Colors, Bush was shot and paralyzed from the waist down. He was standing in front of a bar in the northeast section of Miami when a volley of shots struck him and 2 others. One of the bullets severed his spine, confining him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Bush knew the gunfire was directed at him because he saw the shooter clearly and recognized him, but he refused to tell the police the assailant's name. The feigned expressions of regret over the death of Michael Frazier by E4 and his crew did not stop them from continuing to kill with impunity. If E4 felt threatened, slighted, or double-crossed, he would order that the offending party be rubbed out. When he learned from trusted sources that a local dope dealer named Johnny Belliard planned to rob one of his stash houses, E4 and Plex paid Cedric Brantley $1,000 and a baggie filled with cocaine to kill Belliard. Plex told him he would receive an additional half a kilo of coke when the job was done, and Belliard, who was also known as Fabian, was DEAD. Brantley had a newly acquired Ruger .223 Mini 14 rifle that he had stolen in a residential burglary the day before, and figured it would be the perfect weapon to assassinate Fabian. That evening, he hid in an overgrown field next to Belliard's house and waited for him to return home. The rifle only had 10 bullets in it when he stole it. He shot 7 of them into an old, abandoned washing machine in back of the Diamond's government housing project earlier in the day, practicing, so he knew he had to be prudent with the 3 bullets he had left. It only took 1. When Johnny Belliard pulled his 1958 Chevy Impala into his driveway and exited the driver's side, Cedric Brantley took careful aim and fired. The .223 round, traveling at 3,200 feet per second, struck Belliard in the back of the head. When it exited, it blew his forehead and half of his face away. He was gone before he hit the ground. Brantley walked from the scene to Plex's house 5 blocks away and told him Belliard was gone. Plex wanted to be sure, so he and Cedric drove by the crime scene, which was now taped off and crawling with police. They then drove to E4's warehouse, where Plex gave Cedric his half key of cocaine. The threat posed to E4 by Belliard had been eliminated. May 19, 1996, 9 p.m. Moses Brown had been out of prison for less than a year, but he already had obligations. He had done a 3-year stretch for armed robbery, and when he was released, his 2 baby mamas, Erica and Ingrid, were waiting. Between them, they had 4 children he had fathered before he was locked up. They were all girls. The oldest was 6, and the youngest had just turned 4. Since his release, he lived at home with his mother in Bunshea Park and spent most days on the streets hustling for money in any way he could. Moses primarily supported himself by selling dope in front of a mom-and-pop grocery store in Opelika. 2 weeks prior, a Haitian named Don, whom he had met in prison, approached his spot and bought several packets of cocaine powder. Don asked Moses if he could introduce him to someone who could buy weight, meaning large quantities. He told Moses he would pay him for the introduction and any future deals he could broker. Seeing this as a golden opportunity, Moses contacted his supplier, Skinny Kenny. Skinny Kenny told Moses that he was eager to buy as much dope as the Haitian wanted to sell. After several phone calls between Don and Moses, Don agreed to initially sell a kilo to Skinny Kenny. When he arrived with the kilo, Skinny Kenny produced a pistol and attempted to rob Don for the drugs. Don brandished his own gun and shot Skinny Kenny in the back as he tried to run. Moses had no idea the RIP was going to take place, but because he had vouched for Skinny Kenny and set up the deal, Don was now after him. Don's full name was Donald Lorfels, and he was a member of E4's gang. 3 days after the failed dope rip, Moses received a phone call from Don, who wanted to meet and straighten things out. Moses told his girlfriend that he was apprehensive about seeing Don, but felt that he might be able to smooth things over. He admitted to her that he had had a bad feeling about meeting with Don. She told him not to go, but he said, "No, I'm going to go and try and fix this." He wrote down Don's phone number on a piece of paper and handed it to her, saying, "If anything happens to me, tell the police this is who did it." Moses left his mother's house and started walking to the store to meet Don. He had gone only a couple of blocks when 3 cars came to a screeching halt beside him. It was E4 and his people, there to collect another debt in blood. One of the vehicles was the same stolen Honda that was used in the triple murder at the Colors. Fat Wayne Baptiste and Plex exited one of the sedans armed with AK-47s. Moses stood on the sidewalk frozen with fear as they leveled the rifles at him and began firing. He collapsed almost immediately. Both shooters stood over him and continued firing. His body was mangled by bullets. At the autopsy, more than 20 entrance and exit holes were counted by the medical examiner. Several of the rounds passed through him and gouged out large chunks of concrete from the sidewalk beneath him. One of the projectiles entered the open window of a nearby house. It traveled through the bedroom where an 80-year-old woman had just laid down on her bed. The bullet passed only inches above her face and lodged in the back wall of her home. She said she heard a distinctive whistling sound as it passed over her. Another projectile ricocheted off the sidewalk and struck Fat Wayne in the forearm. Within 11 minutes of the shooting, he drove himself to the emergency room of nearby North Shore Hospital for treatment. An X-ray showed the bullet embedded in his forearm, but he refused any further treatment and left the hospital when the police were called by the ER staff. 3 years later, Detective Mike Hernandez obtained a search warrant to retrieve the bullet from Fat Wayne's forearm. Several U.S. Marshals took him to the Ryder Trauma Center where Dr. David Schatz from the University of Miami Medical Center performed surgery and removed the projectile. The bullet was introduced as evidence against him in the federal trial, charging him with the murder of Moses Brown. November 5, 1996, 3 p.m. Tarvis Miller had an ankle monitor attached to his right leg. Due to jail overcrowding, some inmates were given the option to remain under house arrest with the monitor for the last 4 months of their sentences. The device was tracked by a private company who would notify the police if the wearer ventured more than 250 feet from the base unit. The base unit was connected to the landline telephone box on the outside of the prisoner's house. Fortunately for Tarvis, the phone box at his father's residence was on the east side, which meant that his perimeter extended far enough to reach Anita's bar. This allowed him to sell many bags of crack in the parking lot while he was on house arrest. It was a perfect location because any cars southbound on 22nd Avenue could just pull in, quickly exchange money for a small packet, and drive off. It was like a drive-in window for dope. A big problem with the location, though, was that it was directly across the street from the One-of-a-Kind bar. The One-of-a-Kind was owned by Janet Flint, Michael Chico Harper's mother, and was a favorite hangout for both the Boobie Boys and E4's crew. Nothing annoyed E4 more than someone selling dope in Little River without his permission. He considered it a personal insult. When he saw how Travis Miller's one-man enterprise was flourishing, he ordered Willie Simmons, aka Willie Reed, to tell him to shut it down. Willie Reed crossed the street and told Tarvis he was on the wrong turf and had to close the hole. Tarvis screamed at Willie Reed, "I ain't closing shit. I was born and raised here. You ain't gonna tell me where I can serve when my house is right there." 4 days later, Tarvis was still selling. A block away, Willie Reed pulled a red Oldsmobile Cutlass behind Artie's gambling house. E4 removed an AK-47 from the trunk and got into the rear passenger seat. Willie Reed drove the Cutlass south on 22nd Avenue as E4 lowered the rear window and leaned out, firing the rifle repeatedly at Tarvis. Struck twice in the chest, he fell on his back and passed away with his eyes open. After the crime scene had been processed, Tarvis Miller's body was loaded into the medical examiner's van and taken to the medical examiner's office to be autopsied. As the van drove away, the ankle monitor alerted the base unit that he had left his restricted area, and the Department of Corrections was notified. Pagan, aka White Boy Dave, and E4 were lifelong brothers, almost like brothers. Many people thought they were brothers. They grew up in the same neighborhood and hung out together since they were toddlers. In the early 90s, at E4's urging, Pagan began transporting drugs to Jacksonville, Florida. In 1992, Pagan married Dolores Bailey, whose brother Nathaniel Gardner had a thriving dope spot in Jacksonville. E4 encouraged Pagan to use Dolores to transport kilos of cocaine to her brother, cocaine that E4 would supply. Pagan and his wife eventually moved to Jacksonville and returned on a regular basis to Miami to purchase kilos of powdered cocaine from E4. Pagan would realize a profit of $3,000 per kilo. He brought up the road to Gardner. After a brief time, Gardner introduced Pagan to another dealer named Dexter, who owned a tire store. He began supplying Dexter with kilos. Dexter then introduced him to Jason Stevens, aka Psycho, who owned a meat market on Moncrief Street. Psycho soon became one of Pagan's customers. The demand for kilos from Gardner, Dexter, and Psycho was so great that Pagan was forced to hire several of his wife's female cousins as mules to deliver the drugs. Psycho and Pagan ultimately had a falling out over money and decided to part ways. Plex stepped in and filled the void by delivering kilos to Psycho that he had acquired from E4. Psycho certainly lived up to his nickname. In 1997, he was arrested for the murder of a 3-year-old boy. He killed the child by strangling him to death. On June 2nd, 1997, Psycho negotiated a drug deal with Robert Sparrow Jr. Psycho and 3 others went to Sparrow's house to exchange money for drugs. As soon as he walked into the house, Psycho produced a 9mm pistol and announced a robbery. He grabbed Robert Sparrow III, who was 3 years and 4 months old, and held him at gunpoint, demanding that his father hand over the drugs. The boy's mother attacked Psycho, trying to free her son, and Psycho struck her on the bridge of the nose with the pistol. He then ejected a bullet from the gun to show that it was loaded. The 6 occupants in the house, including a 6-year-old girl, were herded into a bathroom. One of the accomplices guarded the bathroom door while Psycho searched the residence for money and narcotics. Psycho told the victims he was taking the youngster as insurance. He said that if no one followed him, he would release him on the corner. He was about to exit the front door with the child when Robert Sparrow's half-brother, David Cobb, showed up in a dark green Kia. Psycho forced Cobb into the bathroom at gunpoint with the others and took the keys to the Kia from him. Psycho's 3 accomplices were waiting, parked at the curb in a black vehicle. When they realized that Psycho was kidnapping the 3-year-old, they refused to let him in the car and drove off. He therefore shoved the boy into the Kia and sped away. 7 hours later, the Kia was located in a residential area. Robert Sparrow III was lying face down on the passenger seat, unalive. The medical examiner determined the 3-year-old had been strangled to death. The autopsy revealed numerous areas of petechiae in his eyes and on his face. Petechial hemorrhages, or petechiae, are pinpoint red dots that appear because of pressure building up in the capillaries and causing them to rupture. They are almost easily visible in the white scleral membranes of the eyes, in the conjunctiva of the eyes, or on the underside of the eyelids, but can appear on the skin of the face. They are caused by inconstant pressure and are seen 90% of the time in manual strangulation, also known as throttling. The intermittent squeezing on the throat and releasing of pressure will cause the small vessels to burst. Manual strangulation in children is hard to detect because the hyoid bone, the cartilage that holds the airway open, is far more flexible in young people than in adults and may not break. During his trial, Jason Stevens, Psycho, claimed that when he left the boy in the car, he was still alive. The 12-person jury did not believe him. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Francina McIntosh was a few years older than Boobie and grew up with him in Carol City. They were very close, and Boobie even referred to her as his aunt. Francina leased a house in northwest Miami-Dade County with her cousin Malcolm Shaw, aka Rat, who was also Boobie's cousin. Rat began trafficking cocaine at about the same time Boobie seized control of the Matchbox projects. Rat had a secret supplier who always had an ample stockpile of cocaine. He would regularly accommodate Boobie by selling him cut-rate kilos, but refused to divulge his source, fearing that Boobie would try to rob him. Francina assisted Rat by counting the cash proceeds and keeping track of the inventory. In return, Rat paid the rent and all the utility bills. She had twin sons who lived with them. Rat used Francina's 14-year-old twin boys, Cedric and Chedrick, to deliver packages of cocaine in Carol City, utilizing taxicabs that he would pay for. In return, he would buy them school clothes, stereo equipment, and other expensive gifts. At various times, Rat's brother Sebastian Jacobs, aka Bess, would assist with deliveries and collections of the drugs and money. In the early 90s, Francina started dating a Miami-Dade police officer named Marvin Baker. When Baker visited Francina, Rat tested him by, at first, leaving lines of cocaine on the glass coffee table, and then allowing him to see bricks of cocaine in an open duffel bag. Since Baker seemed unfazed by the drugs and made no effort to arrest him, Rat decided Baker was all right and began openly displaying cocaine and money in front of him. He eventually proposed to Baker that they could form a profitable partnership by ripping off his customers. Baker agreed. Using his marked green and white Metro-Dade police vehicle, equipped with overhead red lights and clad in his full police uniform, Baker would stop buyers either leaving or on their way to Rat's house. If Rat sold kilos to an unsuspecting buyer, Baker would wait down the street, follow the buyer, and conduct a traffic stop. He would search the vehicle, impound the drugs, and tell the driver to be on his way. He would then return the kilos to Rat, who would pay him a flat fee of $2,000 per kilo. If Rat knew the type of vehicle a buyer was driving, Baker would stop it en route to Rat's house and confiscate the cash. They would choose their marks carefully. First-time buyers from out of town were frequent targets. They would typically pick buyers who were alone and looked soft, someone who would not resist or make a formal complaint. Boobie found out about their seemingly foolproof scheme and wanted in. He also provided Baker with victims to rob. They got away with it for years, robbing dozens of individuals without a mishap. In 1995, Baker teamed up with Trevin Johnson, another Metro-Dade uniformed cop, and conducted similar rip-offs for another group of narcotics dealers. Johnson, a former Eagle Scout, approached Baker for help because he couldn't keep up. He had too many dope dealers to stop and steal from. Everything finally came unraveled when one of the victims complained to Internal Affairs. Through the first victim, the Internal Affairs investigators found dozens of more people who had been robbed by the duo. They obtained a wiretap and discovered additional illegal activities. Finally, they conducted a sting operation that snared both Johnson and Baker. Undercover detectives posing as drug dealers were stopped and robbed by the crooked cops. Each stole a duffel bag containing 4.5 kilos of cocaine and $16,000. Officers Baker and Johnson were charged with racketeering in state court and faced life sentences. The prosecution had over 1,500 recorded conversations between the officers and the bad guys that were played for the jury. After an exhaustive 4-month trial, Baker was acquitted of all charges, even though his co-defendant, Trevin Johnson, who pleaded guilty just before trial, testified against him. Baker was the only defendant found not guilty. The 6 other defendants were declared guilty of racketeering by the jury. Johnson was sentenced to 25 years in state prison. Marvin Baker had additional problems, however. It was decided that the rip-offs he committed with Boobie and Rat would be included in the federal CCE continuing criminal enterprise case being put together by the North End Task Force. Marvin Baker was hired as a police officer by Metro-Dade County in 1983. Most of his career was spent in uniform patrolling the streets of Carroll City. On July 29, 1988, Baker was severely wounded by gunfire as he stood with a crowd of patrons in front of a Northwest Dade tavern. Multiple shots were fired at the group as they congregated in front of Mr. B's lounge. The lounge was in the same shopping plaza as MDPD's North District substation. Baker's cousin, Causey Bryant, was also hit, along with another man and a woman. All 4 were transported to local hospitals. Baker was the most seriously wounded. He was struck in the upper leg and lost a critical amount of blood on the scene. Sam Ferguson was shot in the forearm and leg. A bullet lodged in the left hip of the 20-year-old female. At first, it was thought that Marvin Baker was targeted because he was a police officer, but it was later learned that the gunmen were trying to kill Sam Ferguson. Witnesses identified one of the shooters as Joseph Sweeting, aka Oomp, who was an enforcer for the Untouchables street gang that operated out of Gould's in the southern part of Miami-Dade County. Sweeting is a suspect in numerous murders in South Florida, but his most famous slayings occurred in Atlanta at a party following Super Bowl 34. On January 31, 2000, he was with Baltimore Ravens All-Pro linebacker Ray Lewis when a fight broke out in the Cobalt Lounge between Lewis's entourage and a group of revelers from Ohio. The fight spilled out into the parking lot, and during the melee, 2 men from the Ohio party were stabbed and killed. The day before the murders, Lewis was signing autographs at a Sports Authority and was accompanied by Sweeting. Sweeting purchased 3 knives at the Sports Authority. One of the knives was a 7-inch Gerber Chameleon 2, which is used to gut animals. The autopsy revealed that the wounds sustained by the victims were consistent with that type of knife. It was a vicious attack. Both victims were stabbed multiple times. Lewis initially claimed he knew nothing about the fight, but then changed his story when blood from the victims was found in his limousine. He was wearing a white suit the night of the murders that has never been recovered. It is believed that the suit was blood-soaked and was disposed of by Lewis. He blamed his 2 companions, Joseph Sweeting and Reginald Oakley, for the deaths of these victims. He even testified against them, but did so half-heartedly, and both were acquitted. On the stand, he denied much of what he had originally told the prosecutors and investigators. He was allowed to plead guilty to a misdemeanor charge of obstruction of justice and placed on probation for 12 months. During the murder trial, Ray Lewis claimed that he barely knew Sweeting. That was not true. They were longtime friends, and Lewis knew Sweeting's background well. Sweeting did not hide his criminal activities. In fact, he flaunted them. He was an avid supporter of the Miami Hurricanes football team, which Ray Lewis played for. He and the infamous rapper Luther Campbell were allowed unlimited access to the sidelines during games and threw wild, lavish parties for the players afterward at local bars and strip clubs. Even though both Lewis and Sweeting served no jail time for the Atlanta killings, Sweeting was furious that Lewis testified against him. He called him a rat and refused to speak to him after the trial. In a rap song he wrote about the incident, Sweeting basically admitted to the murders in the lyrics, saying, "If I knew what I knew now, it would have been 3 bodies." While dating Baker, Francina heard persistent rumors on the street that he was a dirty cop who would rob people of their money and drugs. She was not convinced until she was present one day when Rat and Baker orchestrated the ripoff of a dope dealer known as Collard Green. Collard Green was stopped by Baker for an alleged traffic violation, and $48,000 was stolen from him. She was present when Rat and Baker split the proceeds. After that, she witnessed many similar incidents. Francina and Baker eventually split up, and she started dating one of Boobie's close friends, Michael Harper, aka Chico, whose mother owned the one-of-a-kind bar, the hangout for the Boobie boys. Chico told her that he had filed a formal complaint against Marvin Baker with the police internal affairs section. He said he had been stopped on more than one occasion when Baker stole money or drugs from him. He told her, I'm tired of getting ripped off by Officer Baker. April of 1998 was the last time Francina spoke to Marvin Baker. He came to the hospital to visit her terminally ill father. She asked him for money to buy a funeral dress, and he simply walked out of the room. Thievery by police officers is extremely rare. Criminals in uniform like Marvin Baker and Trevin Johnson are detested by all good, honest cops who are inescapably tarnished by their misdeeds. Corruption, misconduct, and abuse of power among law enforcement officers is surprisingly uncommon. Yeah, right. While it is true that most major law enforcement agencies have had corruption problems, the percentage of law enforcement officers who are bad apples is far less than 1% of the more than 800,000 officers in the United States. Lawyers, doctors, and clergymen have higher rates of wrongdoing. In 1966, a Dade County grand jury returned indictments charging Manson Hill Chief of Detectives Sergeant Dave Hellman, head of the intelligence unit, and jewel thief Joseph Cacciatore with an assortment of crimes. Cacciatore was the first cousin of mafia crime boss Santo Trafficante. He was also one of the notorious silk stocking bandits who terrorized victims during armed home invasion robberies throughout Dade County. One of the victims who testified against the trio was Mrs. Edwin Heidman. She had a priceless gold bracelet stolen during a robbery. She told the grand jury that she was at Tropical Park Racetrack in the grandstands one day when she saw a woman wearing her stolen bracelet. She called the police, who confronted the woman. The woman identified herself as Mrs. Manson Hill, the wife of the chief of detectives at the sheriff's office. For the next 14 years, Director Purdy transformed the Metro Dade Police Department into one of the finest police agencies in the country, and it remains so today. His legacy of professionalism and excellence at the Miami-Dade Police Department is undeniable. Exactly 2 weeks after the double murder at the Amoco gas station, where Tyrone Tarver and Roger Davis were brutally mowed down with AK-47s, the Boobie boys struck again. 2 gunmen shot and killed 30-year-old John Davis and wounded an innocent bystander at the 79th Street one-stop store. Davis was targeted because he was selling on Boobie's turf. Boobie and Israel Baptiste had been squabbling for months over what Boobie called his $1 million spot because of the high-traffic strip club located across the street. Boobie paid the owner of the store a small percentage of his sales for the rights to the parking lot. Baptiste refused to remove his people, so Boobie ordered the twins, Bo and Nar Brown, to take their territory back. Baptiste was the intended victim, but he was not there that day. Davis was selling packets of crack when the twins snuck up behind him and opened fire with .40 caliber pistols. Davis was hit multiple times and died instantly. The entire murder was caught on the store's video camera footage. Video technology was not as advanced in 1998 as it is today, but although it is blurry, it does accurately depict the crime. Corey Muckerson, aka Fish Grease, was the getaway driver. The death of John Davis convinced the North End Task Force just how crucial it was that they act quickly to end the violence. They needed to get the main players off the streets to stop the slaughter. Their proposed strategy of securing warrants for federal gun violations was working even better than they had hoped. Detectives Jeff Lewis, Mike Hernandez, Chuck Clark, Joe Mallett, and Officer Tony scoured the criminal histories of the main players in both factions. They found numerous weapons charges that the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office had simply abandoned with no explanation. Vonda Jackson, for example, was arrested on 2 separate occasions with a handgun in her possession. She was charged with carrying a concealed firearm and possession of a concealed firearm and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon by the arresting officers in both cases. And in both cases, the charges were nol prost. That is, dropped, not dismissed by a judge, but inexplicably not prosecuted by the state attorney's office. The more research that was conducted, the angrier the task force got. Virtually every member of the Boobie Boys and Vonda's gang had similar cases that were dumped by the Miami-Dade prosecutors. Cases that, if pursued, could have put these violent predators in prison and stopped some of the pointless killings. It was unfathomable. The 2 federal agents assigned to the task force, Carlos Canino from ATF and Lenny Athos from DEA, were a perfect fit. They had the same "let's put these assholes in prison" attitude that the rest of them did. Agent Canino reviewed all the gun charges they submitted and presented them to AUSA Chris Clark to be filed. In most instances, the guns were still impounded and available as evidence. Carlos retrieved all the weapons and had them test fired at the Miami-Dade Crime Lab to see if they ballistically matched any of the murders. In several cases, they hit the jackpot, and the lab made a match to the open homicides. Things were definitely falling into place quickly for the task force. One day in mid-March, Lieutenant White called Officer Tony into his office and said, "Dave Simmons from Northside District is being assigned to your task force. He'll start on Monday." Sergeant Dave "Spiffy" Simmons had been a homicide detective in the 70s and early 80s. He worked on many high-profile cases, including serial killer Robert Frederick Carr. Carr was a pedophile who raped and strangled 2 11-year-old boys who were reported missing while hitchhiking in North Miami Beach. He committed similar murders in Connecticut and Mississippi and was thought to have sexually molested hundreds of children. Miami Herald reporter Edna Buchanan conducted over 120 hours of jailhouse interviews with Carr and authored a book that chronicled his crimes. When Carr passed away in a North Florida prison in 2007, Buchanan was quoted as saying, "He was about the most evil person I ever met. It's such good news that he is no longer on the planet." Dave was given the nickname Spiffy early in his career because he looked like he stepped out of the pages of GQ magazine. He was always impeccably dressed in expensive 3-piece suits that were a stark contrast to the suits Officer Tony wore right off the rack from J.C. Penney's. They often joked that Dave probably slept in a suit. He was not only meticulous in his attire, but he was also an equally meticulous investigator. Every task force needed an organizer to keep track of everything, and Dave became theirs. While they were compiling the gun cases, they began gathering information on both groups. They reached out to Detective Rodney Polite, who first gave Officer Tony Boobie's name during the Jerry Dukes murder investigation 4 years earlier. He put Officer Tony in touch with several people who grew up with Boobie and knew him well. Jeff Lewis had a huge stable of informants in the Carroll City area, and he started contacting them one by one. From all these sources, they were able to identify many of the main players and put together rosters for both groups. A veritable who's who of criminals. But it was Chuck Clark who would discover the greatest of all time, Snitch. One day in March, Chuck stuck his head in Officer Tony's cubicle. "Sarge, I just got a call from a guy who claims to know everything about the Boobie boys. He wants to meet me in the parking lot behind the library. Do you want to go?" "Absolutely," Officer Tony said, as he grabbed his Beretta 9mm from the bottom drawer of his desk and holstered it. He snatched his handheld radio out of the charger and headed out the door of the homicide office with Chuck. When they pulled into the parking lot on the east side of the Carroll City Public Library, they spotted a lone black male seated on a bench. He waved them over and quickly climbed into the back seat of their car. He introduced himself as Roderick and said, "Let's get out of here so no one will see me with you guys." For the next 4 hours, as they drove around Carroll City, he filled them in on the hierarchy of the Boobie boys and the criminal activities they were involved in. As he talked, Officer Tony furiously scribbled page after page of notes on his yellow legal pad. He had grown up with Boobie and his inner circle and was still tight with all of them. As he talked, he gave Chuck directions and took them by the houses of the main players. He pointed out their girlfriends' houses as well. Even though their rented car had dark-tinted windows, Roderick was initially hesitant to point out the locations until they used an old robbery bureau trick. They stopped at a public supermarket, and Officer Tony ran in and got an ordinary brown paper bag. Officer Tony tore eye holes in the bag and told Roderick to put it over his head. When they were in robbery, they would use the paper bag over the head ploy to drive informants directly into the projects, where they would point out the robbers that they knew. They would often have a crowd around their car, peering into the windows, trying to figure out who the unknown snitch was. Now feeling more comfortable with the bag, Roderick agreed to take them to the favorite hangouts of the Boobie boys. When he took them by the one-of-a-kind bar, he pointed to two men standing near the front door. "There go Boobie and E4 right there," he said. That was the first time Officer Tony had ever laid eyes on Kenneth Boobie Williams or Ephraim E4 Casado. Over the next 3 years, Roderick remained a valuable source of information on the Boobie boys. His tips were always on the money and led to the seizure of many automatic weapons and multiple kilos of cocaine. One day he called the homicide office and said that 2 out-of-town dope dealers had just purchased 3 kilos of cocaine in Carroll City. He added that they had boarded a Greyhound bus with a suitcase containing the 3 kilos and $280,000 in cash. The bus was bound for New York. Jeff Lewis notified the Florida Highway Patrol, who stopped the bus on I-95. Sure enough, in the baggage compartment of the Greyhound, a drug dog alerted on a light brown suitcase. When it was opened, it contained 3 kilos and $280,000, $500,000 in today's money. As they dropped him off that first day, Officer Tony asked Roderick why he was helping them. "I thought you might throw some money my way sometimes," he said. "And besides, I get in trouble a lot, and I thought maybe you could help me out when I do." He gave them a slight smile and turned and walked away. By the end of April, they had identified 20 firearms cases that could be filed federally on members of both gangs. Chris Clark reviewed them and signed the complaints as quickly as he could. One of the cases involved a vehicle chase in 1997 in the city of Miami. Boobie, E4, and James Vinny Delavoche fled from uniformed officers in a Honda that was reportedly stolen. During the pursuit, The occupants threw out 2 AK-47s, an Uzi submachine gun, bulletproof vests, and ski masks. The trio bailed out of the SUV and fled on foot into a residential neighborhood. A perimeter was established, and a K-9 quickly located all three. They were all arrested and charged as felons in possession of firearms, but the state attorney's office, not surprisingly, declined to prosecute them. Roderick, their new confidential informant, knew all about the incident. He said they had received information that Vonda was hosting a party in Overtown. They knew Rara and the rest of her crew would be there, and they were on their way to kill them all when the police intervened. By the beginning of May, the task force had active federal warrants for all the main players and even some of the lesser participants. The federal firearms statute was a great tool to swiftly dismantle the two gangs. The penalties were harsh, and the elements were easy to prove. The law doesn't even require the possession of a gun. Possession of ammunition violates the statute equally. A career criminal caught with a single bullet in his pants pocket could conceivably go to federal prison for 20 years. The adage often repeated on the streets is, "The feds don't play." The first of either crew to be arrested was Famous Johnson. The MDPD Career Criminal Unit located him and brought him to the homicide office where he was interviewed. He was young, arrogant, and cocky. He was convinced that the gun charges would be dropped just like they always had been, and refused to talk about his relationship with Vonda. I guess no one told him the feds don't play. He did, however, want to talk about the murder of his close friend Roger Davis, who was killed 2 months earlier at the Amoco gas station. He claimed that Jonathan Hawthorne, aka Moose, was there when the murder occurred. He said that Moose was not one of the shooters, but possibly drove the getaway car. He maintained that the murders were payback for Moose being shot a year earlier in Overtown. Famous told Jeff Lewis, the lead detective on the Roger Davis case, that Moose cut his hair the day after the murder because news reports maintained that one of the attackers had long dreads. Jeff was able to locate a jail booking photo taken 6 days before the murder that showed Moose with long dreads. He also found a booking photo taken 10 days after the murder that depicted Moose with a shaved head. Officer Tony checked the name Jonathan Hawthorne in the criminal computer system and found that he had an open warrant for violation of probation. He also had a court date in 72 hours on an unrelated matter. Officer Tony sat in the courtroom 3 days later, not sure if he would show up or not, but he did. And as he walked out of the courtroom, Officer Tony arrested him. Back at the homicide office, he was eager to talk about himself being shot, but denied any involvement in the murder of Roger Davis. He said in 1995, he opened a drug hole in Overtown that directly conflicted with an operation already in place and controlled by Vonda Jackson. When Eddie Donaldson was murdered along with 2 others on the Palmetto Expressway, Moose decided to take over his spot. Using $750 he won in a Bolita game, he bought some crack and began selling. He assumed that since Donaldson was dead, anyone could take over his location. Apparently, Vonda disagreed and sent Rara and Famous to kill him. Both were armed with AK-47s. He was shot multiple times in an ambush in front of his father's house. He remained on the verge of death for months in the ICU at Jackson Hospital. He was paralyzed from the waist down as a result of the attack and was treated at the Miami Project to cure paralysis for a year until he was able to walk again, all at taxpayers' expense. This was the first time he told any police officer or detective who shot him. This was part 4 of the Boobie Boys. See y'all next time.